wooden ribs, plywood, and a sheet of stretched fabric over the top. A training machine, the kind on which school kids learn to lift their wheels off the ground. On paper, a perfect target, a gift to any fighter pilot. And now, brace yourself. It was precisely this plywood contraption that kept whole German units from sleeping for months and became the most hated nightmare on the entire Eastern Front. How is that even possible? The finest aces of the Luftwaffe, the terror of the European sky, ground their teeth in helpless fury and could do nothing about it. Not because the machine was strong, but because it was too weak. Sounds like a mockery of common sense, doesn't it? Yet behind this paradox lies a cold piece of physics that even jet interceptors fell into years after the war. Yes, you heard that right, jet interceptors. And that is not even the most astonishing part, because most often, at the controls of this unkillable machine, there sat no seasoned veterans with thousands of flight hours. At the controls sat yesterday's schoolgirls, young women barely past 20. Who were they? Why did they fly without parachutes? And what was that one-of-a-kind victory this slow machine scored over a jet aircraft without firing a single shot? Stay with me to the end, and you will learn what people long preferred to keep silent about. I will show you how weakness was turned into a weapon, how plywood outplayed metal and steel, and what price was paid by those whom their commander called simply her daughters. This is a story after which you will never again look at the word obsolete the same way. Here is a fact that stumps anyone used to measuring war in horsepower and kilometers per hour. The Po-2 survived, not in spite of being slow, but because of it. It sounds like a mockery of common sense, yet it is pure physics, and arguing with it is pointless. German fighters were built for high-speed combat. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a machine for clashes at hundreds of kilometers per hour, a predator honed for the swift strike and the swift retreat. The plywood biplane, meanwhile, crawled close to the ground at 130 to 150 kilometers per hour and at cruising speed barely 110. By every rule of the aerial hunt, this meant one thing: easy prey, a sure trophy, another mark on the fuselage. In reality, it was the exact opposite. The whole trick lies in one devastating number: the stall speed of the Messerschmitt, the line below which its wing stops holding the machine in the air, was roughly equal to the maximum speed of the Po-2. Take that in. To get on the slow biplane's tail and aim with any calm, the German ace had to throttle down almost to the very edge at which his own fighter would drop into a spin. Slow down any more, and that is the end of him. He falls on his own, without a single shot from the ground. Don't slow down, and he flashes past at murderous speed, snatching at best one crooked, hurried burst into empty air, a dead end. This relates to the simple and merciless arithmetic of the fight. Picture yourself tearing along in a racing car after a boy on a bicycle who weaves between the trees in a cramped courtyard. Under your hood is a herd of horsepower, and the use of it is exactly zero. You either shoot past at full tilt or crawl on the brink, risking a stall and a nosedive into the dirt. The boy turns his handlebars and slips aside, and you are helpless with all your might. That is precisely the humiliating position in which the king of the European sky found himself against a plywood contraption. The biplane, meanwhile, pulled off things the fast machine simply could not. It turned on a coin, dove down to the very treetops, hugged the ground until it merged with it in the dark. Against a headwind, it could hang almost motionless, like a ghost. To catch such a target in the sights at nearly 500 kilometers per hour is a near impossible task, even for a seasoned ace. Now add to that the night, the pitch darkness, and the total absence of any landmark beneath the wing. This relates as well to the anti-aircraft guns, on which the Germans pinned their last hope. The heavy artillery could not handle this target either. The plane went low, quiet, and slow, surfaced out of nowhere, and dissolved back into the dark just as silently. The guns were built for other altitudes, other speeds, for the roar of bomber engines, not for a chattering sewing machine right under the crowns of the trees. The result was a vicious circle, too slow for the fighter, too low for the flak, too nimble for the searchlights. A machine that could not be shot down by every law of war and which still had to be hunted every single night. Forget the picture of blazing divisions and craters stretching to the horizon. The Po-2 was never thrown into heavy bombing, and that is not why it rose into the sky. Its job was harassment raids, and behind that dull military term hid a far more insidious weapon than tons of explosives. The point was not to wipe a German division off the face of the earth. The point was to deny it the right to live. To deny it sleep, deny it repairs. Deny it the chance to quietly pull up reserves and fuel under cover of night. One biplane, then a second, then a third, and so on, until dawn, around and around without a break. The enemy had to feel that the sky above him did not belong to him for a single minute. The numbers of the bomb load speak for themselves, and they speak loudly. The Po-2 carried a deliberately light load, up to 250 kilograms, and the standard nightly norm came down to just 2 to 4 bombs of 50-kilogram caliber. Now, compare. The frontline bomber P-2 carried up to 1,000 kilograms. The Il-2 ground attack plane, around 600. The Plywood crawler hauled into the sky many times less than any serious combat machine. By the logic of the data tables, this was a mockery, not a payload. This relates to the very heart of its tactics. In that night war, the weight of bombs decided nothing. Something else decided everything. The relentless blow against a living human being. Not against equipment, not against depots, not against maps in a headquarters, but against the nerves of one concrete soldier in a trench. And here, the Plywood contraption struck more precisely than any heavy bomber. Picture a German infantryman beneath that sky. He drops off his feet after a day of fighting, sinks into sleep, and then, in the darkness above his head, comes that steady, unmistakable chatter of an engine. The soldier jumps up, leaps into the trench, presses himself into the earth, waits for the blast. Whether it strikes nearby or misses is beside the point, because his body is already locked in the spasm of waiting. Time passes, he tries to sleep again, slides into a shaky doze, and an hour later it all repeats, and again, and again. This relates to a resource prized in war no less than cartridges and fuel sleep. This was a war for the enemy's nervous system, for his rest, for his very ability to stand on his feet in the morning and think straight in battle. A sleepless, frayed, worn-down soldier shoots worse, thinks slower, makes more mistakes. Each such night ground the enemy down, not with a loud blast, but with 1,000 small jabs from which there was no escape. The Plywood crawlers methodically drained the strength and the will out of the German units every night, without a day off, until the break of dawn. And now, the main thing, the part that made German hair stand on end. That very nightmare that hung over their trenches for months was most often held in the hands of young women. Not seasoned men with thousands of flight hours behind them, but yesterday's schoolgirls, barely past 20. The chief authors of this nightly torment were the airwomen of the 588th Night Light Bomber Regiment. Later, for the blood it shed and the feats it performed, it earned a proud name, the 46th Guards Tamon Regiment. The regiment was entirely female, from the first person to the last. Young women at the controls, young women over the navigation charts, young women with wrenches at the engines, young women hanging the bombs. Not a single man, and yet combat work on such a scale that the figures still ring like pure fantasy. Here are those figures, and let them be spoken at full voice. 23,672 combat sorties over the course of the war. Almost 3,000 tons of bombs dropped on the enemy's head by these seemingly fragile hands. On an ordinary night, a single crew managed 8 to 12 combat sorties. And in the short summer nights, when the front was near and the airfield stood almost on top of it, the number rose to 15 or 18 in a single shift. land, refuel, hang the bombs, and back into the black sky, and so on until the very dawn, with no right to rest. This relates to work that is hard even to imagine by today's measures. 18 sorties a night means taking off almost without a breath, flying through anti-aircraft fire, working the target, finding the way back by feel in the dark, landing on a barely marked strip and starting it all over again, not once in a war, not as a feat written on paper, but as the ordinary norm, night after night, month after month. The body had no time to recover. The eyes drooped shut, but the machines went out into the darkness again. And those bombs under the wings were hung by these young women by hand. No mechanization, no hoists, only the arms, the back, and the firm shoulders of the armorers. A 50-kilogram bomb had to be lifted, dragged, brought under the wing and secured, and so dozens of times a night for every sortie of every crew. In a single shift, the armorers carried tons of cold metal in their arms. Fragile-looking girls did work that left strong, grown men collapsing by morning. And they did it again and again, night after night, without complaint and without mercy on themselves. This relates as well to the honesty of this story, without which it would be incomplete. It was not only women who fought on the Po-2, and it would be untrue to claim otherwise. The most varied night units rose into the sky on this machine, men's units among them. The biplane carried the wounded out from under fire, ferried scouts across the front line, scattered leaflets over the enemy's trenches, delivered urgent dispatches where there was no other way through. It was a true workhorse of the war, hauling on its shoulders an entire layer of dirty and dangerous frontline labor. And yet it was precisely the women's 46th Guards that became the living symbol of this machine, and became it deservedly. Girls who by all logic should have been sitting at school desks and dancing at graduation balls climbed into the cockpit of a plywood contraption and went into the night time after time under searchlights and flak, with no armor beneath the seat and often no parachute on the back. They turned a weak training machine into a weapon that made the finest army in Europe flinch. And they did it not with muscle, but with a will, a training, and a stubbornness stronger than any engine. But it would be a lie to present all this as an easy hunt with the ending known in advance. The plywood immortality had its price, and it was paid in the dearest coin of all. The Germans did not endure the nightly jabs forever. They learned, they seethed, and they prepared a snare built precisely for the slow biplane. The calculation was cold and exact. If the biplane could not be reached by ordinary means, then it had to be caught, blinded, and shot at point blank, stripped of its single trump card in the darkness. An entire hunting scheme was built around this, with every element knowing its role. Searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters worked as a single trap, and a crew caught inside it had almost nothing to escape with. This relates to the night of the 31st of July to the 1st of August 1943 on the Kuban, the blackest night in the regiment's history. That night, the trap worked exactly as designed, without a hitch. First, the searchlight stabbed out of the dark and took the approaching biplane into the crossing of their beams, into a tight fork of light. The crew went instantly blind after the pitch black. The harsh glare seared their sight, and the machine hung in the air as if on an open palm, visible from everywhere and helpless. Then came the worst of it. The anti-aircraft guns, which until that moment had hammered steadily at the sky, suddenly fell silent all at once. That silence was not mercy, but a signal. In the pause that followed, a night fighter slid in from the darkness against the blinded, brightly lit machine, invisible now from the ground, while the dazzled biplane crew could not see it either. The blow came almost point blank, out of the gloom, against a target that swung helplessly in the beams and could neither escape nor answer. This relates to the details that make this story truly heavy. In the early part of the war, the young women often rose into the sky with no parachutes at all. The reason was brutally simple. Every extra kilogram of weight was given over to bombs, to one more blow against the enemy. And a parachute was of little use at their altitudes anyway. The biplane crept along the very treetops, and to jump from such a height was almost pointless, for the canopy would simply have no time to open. They flew without that last lifeline knowingly, fully aware of what they faced each night. That night on the Kuban, 4 crews failed to return from the mission at once. Not one stray aircraft, but 4 at a stroke for a small regiment. This was a wound that would not heal. Among those who did not come back were Flight Commander Evgenia Krutova and Navigator Elena Salikova. These are not faceless lines in a casualty report, but the living names of living young women, each with a voice, a face, habits, dreams of a life after the war. That night, they were lost. This relates to how the regiment took the blow and what it did next. After that night, the tactics were reworked entirely. The approach patterns were changed, mutual cover was thought through, the searchlights were drawn off and suppressed, and the crews stopped flying alone, straight into a prepared trap. The lesson was paid for in lives, and it was learned for good. But that is not the main point. The regiment did not halt for a single night, did not take a pause, did not step back. Already the next night, the plywood machines went out into the darkness again, toward the same searchlights, the same flak, the same night sky that had just taken 4 crews. Each of those who remained knew the price of these flights by name. She knew the trap had not gone anywhere, that a searchlight could flare beneath her own wing, that not every night ended in a return to the airfield. And still she climbed into the cockpit, lifted the bomb-laden contraption into the air, and went at the enemy, not under the lash of an order, but because a place in the line stood empty and had to be filled. That is what truly made up the thing the Germans called, with fear, a nightmare. The Po-2 is habitually called obsolete, and the word stuck to it for good. It stuck unfairly. As a frontline bomber, it really was a weakling. It carried little, flew slowly, was protected by nothing at all. But to judge a machine by someone else's yardstick is the worst kind of mistake. As a night harassment aircraft, the plywood crawler was not obsolete, but almost perfect. Its every weakness turned out, on closer look, to be a strength. It was indecently cheap wood, plywood, fabric, wire, and a simple, undemanding M11 engine. It could be built by the thousands without ruining the country, with no need to tremble over each machine as if over a treasure. It landed on almost any flat meadow, on any scrap of field right by the front line, and needed no concrete runways and no elaborate airfield service. Where temperamental machines demanded a proper airfield, the biplane made do with a pasture beyond the village edge. This relates to a quality prized in war above many loud specifications, the survivability of the whole operation as a single thing. A damaged complex machine often had to be hauled off for factory repair, and it dropped out of service for a long time, taking up space in the workshops and the engineers' time. The Po-2, meanwhile, was repaired all but in an open field by the light of a kerosene lamp. Torn fabric was patched, a snapped wire was replaced, a cracked rib was swapped for a piece of wood. The simple engine was overhauled by the mechanic's own hands. A machine riddled with holes by night went back into the sky by the next night. In wartime, this was not merely convenient, it was priceless. One would think that, with the arrival of the jet age, this plywood contraption was long overdue to vanish into a museum. Speeds had multiplied, engines had given way to turbines, the sky was ruled by swift machines of metal. What place was left in this new world for a slow biplane of wood and fabric? And here, history pulled off a trick that is hard to believe without knowing the physics of flight. This relates to Korea, to the night of the 3rd of May, 1953. 2 machines from different eras met in the sky, the old piston-engined Po-2 and the American jet interceptor, F-94. Starfire, a predator of the new generation, fast, heavy, packed with technology. The Starfire flung itself into pursuit of the slow biplane, like a modern fighter after easy prey, and it fell into the very same trap that had caught German aces over the Eastern Front. To keep the slow target in its sights, the jet had to throttle down more and more, and at some moment it crossed the line beyond which there was no return. It dropped below its own stall speed. It is worth explaining what this line is, because the whole point lives inside it. The stall speed is the minimum speed at which the wing still creates enough lift to hold the aircraft in the air. Fly a little slower, and the smooth flow of air tears away from the wing and stops carrying it. The machine suddenly loses its support. The nose drops sharply downward, and without a reserve of altitude, it can no longer be leveled out. That is exactly what happened to the American. The heavy jet interceptor stalled and went toward the ground. The aircraft was lost. This relates to one of the most paradoxical episodes in the history of aviation. Formerly, the slow Plywood biplane was credited with a one-of-a-kind victory over a jet aircraft, only there was no real duel of cannons here at all. The Po-2 did not down its enemy with fire, it simply held its quiet course, as it had held it through the entire war. And the strong, fast, heavily armed interceptor destroyed itself, trying to match another machine's impossible slowness. The same trap of speeds that doomed the Messerschmitts over the Kuban worked in the jet age too, years later, and at the other end of the earth. And the Plywood contraption had yet another unexpected advantage, as if handed to it by the new era itself. Wood and fabric barely reflected the radar beam. A radar built to catch large metal machines slid across the slow biplane almost in vain. There was simply nothing to reflect the signal. For the world of jet fighters and sharp-eyed radars, the Po-2 turned out to be something like a stone axe that does not ring under a metal detector. Ancient in design, absurd in appearance, and for that very reason, invisible, where the newest technology saw straight through everything. This relates to the main conclusion about this whole machine. Time and again, it was buried as a relic, written off, called obsolete junk. And time and again, it outplayed technology a full generation above it over the night-bound Eastern Front and in the jet sky of Korea alike, not with strength, which it did not have, but with the fact that weakness, set in the right place, no strong opponent ever learned to defeat. The strongest part of this story is not about engines, not about speeds, and not about traps in the night sky. It is about memory. And about one person, thanks to whom not a single nameless name was left in this regiment, erased by the war without a trace. The regiment's commissar, Evdokia Rakevich, was noticeably older than her airwomen. The girls were 17, 20, 22. She was already past 30. By the measure of that women's regiment, this was an enormous gap, a whole lifetime, and the young women, barely torn from their family homes, called her for this, not by rank and not by surname, but simply and warmly, Mama. The nickname stuck for good and said more about her than any service record. She truly was a mother to them in that war, the one they came to with their troubles, with a letter from home, with tears before a flight. This relates to what Rashkevich took upon herself after the last shots had fallen silent. The war ended. The regiment became famous across the whole country. The living returned to peacetime life. But she could not simply close this page and go on living. Too many of her daughters remained lying there, in the south, in foreign soil, near the places where their plywood machines had fallen. For most people, these were lines in a casualty list. For her, they were specific girls, whom she had seen off into the night and had not waited back. And so, a woman no longer young took up a task that stretched out over long years. With money gathered by her former comrades, set aside kopeck by kopeck from modest pensions and wages, Rakevich traveled the south of the country year after year. She went where their airfields had once stood, where their flights had broken off in the night sky. She searched for the very places where their machines had gone into the earth fields, gullies, the edges of Cossack villages. This relates to work that is hard even to picture today. No databases, no convenient archives at hand, only her own feet, her questions, and her stubbornness. She walked through the villages and hamlets, knocked on doors, spoke with the old people, raised up old eyewitness accounts. In one place, they showed her a field over which an aircraft had flared and gone toward the ground that night. In another, they led her to a quiet mound beyond the village edge. She conducted excavations, lifted up what remained, cross-checked, searched for names patiently, year after year, never backing down. In one of the houses, a discovery awaited her that tightens the throat. The documents of 2 airwomen who had not returned were found hidden on the chimney flue. Local people had preserved them through the whole war, through occupation, through hunger and ruin. Simple villagers, strangers to these young women, had kept these papers for years, understanding that someday someone would come for them, and someone did come. This detail says more about that era than volumes of official reports. This relates to why her search was not a simple tribute of memory, but a real fight for the honor of the fallen. In those years, behind the dry words, "missing in action," stood a misfortune that trailed after an entire family. Missing in action is not a confirmed loss in battle. It is the unknown, and the unknown in those days easily turned into suspicion. A shadow fell on the family. Where? How? Under what circumstances did the person vanish? Did they surrender? Did they go over to the other side? The relatives of such people often lived for years under this unspoken weight, deprived even of the right to grieve openly. It was precisely this shadow that Rachkiewicz fought stubbornly, meter by meter, name by name, and she achieved the main thing, the thing for which she laid down so many years. In her regiment, there remained not one nameless woman, not one missing in action. Every one was found. To every one was returned a name, the circumstances, the place where her last flight had broken off. Every one was struck from the terrible list of the missing and written into the honest list of the fallen, before whom a family has nothing to be ashamed of. By the recollections of her former comrades, when the long search was at last completed, Rachkiewicz said simply, now she could depart in peace. Her daughters had been found, every last one. In these words is the whole of her and the whole meaning of what she did. No loud speech, no rostrum, no marble. A quiet woman who gave each of her girls the chance to come home, at least as a name. And in the story of the Plywood Regiment, this single line is worth 10 combat reports. So what is the answer? Why did a plywood contraption, one that a single rifle bullet could bring down, turn out more effective than the enemy's fearsome machines? The answer is simple and uncomfortable for everyone used to measuring war by tables of specifications. The Po-2 won not at all because it was stronger than the Messerschmitt. It was weaker in everything. In any honest sheet of characteristics, it lost to the enemy on every single line without exception. Slower by a wide margin, weaker in armament, the training machine often had nothing at all to snap back with. More defenseless, no armor beneath the seat, no armored glass, nothing to shield the crew from fire. A smaller bomb load a paltry 250 kilograms against the 1,000 of a real bomber. By any point that is held to be decisive in air combat, the plywood crawler was a pure underdog. This relates to the chief delusion on which more than one strong opponent came to grief. War is not a table of characteristics. War is a concrete task. And the question is never put this way: whose machine is faster, more powerful, more heavily armed in isolation from everything else? The question is put differently: whose machine does better, the very thing that needs doing right here, on this night, on this stretch of the front? And for its task, the wearing-down night war of attrition, the plywood biplane was suited as no stronger machine was suited. And that task was solved by a simple, merciless algorithm that repeated night after night, creep up in the dark on low throttle, jab drop its 2 to 4 bombs right where the enemy was trying to sleep, slip away, dissolving close to the ground, return to the field airstrip, refuel, hang fresh bombs, and repeat. And repeat again, 8, 10, 15 times a night, until the very dawn. Not one crushing blow, but an endless chain of small, precise jabs from which the nerves of whole German units gave way. This relates to a simple but uncomfortable law of every struggle. far from the aerial one alone. The weak, set in the right place and doing the right work, defeats the strong. The fast fighter, honed for the swift clash, turned out helpless against the slow machine close to the ground. All its might hung in empty air. And the jet interceptor, the pride of the new era, destroyed itself outright while trying to catch up with an impossible plywood slowness. Strength applied in the wrong place is worth nothing, and weakness applied precisely becomes a weapon with no way to be pinned down. And yet the main answer lies not in the plywood, not in the fabric, and not in the simple M11 engine. The machine was only a tool, nothing more. The true strength of that regiment was in its people, and in its people alone. In girls of 17, 20, 22, who climbed into the cockpit of a training contraption and went into the night sky toward the place where searchlights and flak awaited them. In those who flew 10, 15 sorties a night, with no armor beneath the seat and at times not even a parachute on the back. This relates as well to those who stayed on the ground beneath the wing in the pitch dark of the field airstrip, to the armorers who with bare hands hauled tons of cold metal in a single night and hung bomb after bomb, sortie after sortie, to the point of utter exhaustion. To the mechanics who by the light of a kerosene lamp patched torn fabric and sent the wounded machine back into the sky. To the navigators who by feel, in the darkness, brought the biplane to its target and led it home again. This everyday, dirty, invisible work held up everything the Germans called, with fear, a nightmare. And, set apart, in that woman no longer young, whom her girls called simply Mama, in the commissar, who after the war did not close this page, but for years traveled the south of the country and returned the names of those who did not come back from the night. The regiment fought, so the enemy would have no peace. And she fought, so her fallen would have no nameless graves. And both are about the very same thing, about people who knew exactly why they were there. This is what remains when the roar of the engines dies down and the dust settles over the field airstrips. Not a table of speeds, not the calibers of bombs, not reports of hits. What remains is a simple and firm thought worth carrying away with you. In the sky, and not only in the sky, the victor is not at all the fastest, not the best protected, and not the most fearsomely armed. The victor is the one who knows, to the very end, without wavering and without discount, why he is there. The plywood crawler knew it, and the girls who lifted it into the night knew it best of all. Here our story comes to an end, but the memory of the plywood crawler and of the girls who lifted it into the night must live on. If this story moved you, kept you watching, and opened up something new, give the channel your support. Leave a like under this video. That short movement of a finger helps stories like this one break through to the people for whom they truly matter. Subscribe to the channel if you are not yet with us. There are still many forgotten pages of military aviation ahead, secret designs, and fates that were kept silent for a long time. And be sure to tap the bell beside the subscribe button so you do not miss a new release. Without it, the notifications simply will not reach you. And do write in the comments what gripped you the most: the incredible physics of this fight, the figures of the women's regiment, or the story of the commissar who returned the names of all the fallen. I read your responses, and it is they that tell me what to cover next time. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Until we meet again in the sky.